Okay, welcome back to the second panel on the topic of intersections of race, gender, and labor in the digital age. This particular second panel now will continue actually some of the conversations I'm sure that we just had, but it's going to focus on questions of scale, the allure of speed, supply chains, and algorithms. So I'm very delighted to be actually co-chairing this panel today with my colleague Christian Sandwick from the School of Information and Communication Studies here at the University of Michigan. We'll have the same setup as earlier, where each presenter is given 10 minutes. Also these folks, we asked them to provide an object of alternatives to think with. So many of them, I'm sure, are going to talk about the object of alternatives. Just to reiterate, for the people who are joining us remotely, this panel is generously supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation under their Future of Work at the Human Technology Frontier Division, by the School of Information, and by the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing, which spells ESCAPE. I'll do a very brief introduction of our panelists. The introduction also now is too brief to do justice to their accomplishments, but due to time and really wanting to give the panelists opportunity to really speak, I'll keep this very, very short. So Alessandro Del Fanti is an assistant professor of culture and new media at the University of Toronto. He's the author of Biohackers. Vicky Hattam is a professor of politics at the New School for Social Research in New York. Margaret Jack is a PhD candidate in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University, and Nupur Raval is a PhD candidate in informatics at UC Irvine, interested in digital, labor, gender, and equity. And I already mentioned my my co-discussant, Christian Sandwick, is a professor at the School of Information at the University of Michigan here, and also the director of the Center for Ethics, Society, and Computing. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Sylvia. It's great to be here, and thank you. I want to thank all the groups that's organized the conference for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about Amazon work, in particular Amazon warehouses, or what they call fulfillment centers, which are these gigantic warehouses where all the commodities that we buy online are stored. So there is about 200 of them, thousands and thousands of square feet each. And a global workforce of around 600,000 workers just in the fulfillment centers. In the present, the algorithms that kind of underpin, the functioning of the warehouse enact what I call machinic dispossession. So they capture worker knowledge about the position of an item, and they re-elaborate and use that worker knowledge to assign tasks to the workers who have to go and pick or retrieve that item. They're used for surveillance purposes, so whatever passes through the barcode scanner, which is the main tool, the main instrument of work in those workplaces, is also used to quantify workers' performance, of course. It dictates the pace of work, so the algorithms are used to dictate the speed at which workers have to perform. So very quickly, because I don't really have much time, I'm moving to the future, of course, today. So I'm going to look at forms of automation anxiety. So this is a Amazon delivery drone which comes to your house twice, you're not there, and gets very, very mad at you and, of course, destroys your house. So this is the most, I guess, dystopian view of future automation. But of course, I mean, I'm kind of joking here about this relationship between the utopian liberation from work on the one hand, and also the dystopian kind of mass unemployment generated by future automation. So here, though, in my research, I kind of look at what Marx says when he in Capitalist says that machines do not replace, but rather, and I'm quoting here, create new incentives for capital's insatiable appetite for the labor of others. And I want to add also insatiable appetite for the data of others. So my object here is human workers, and we'll get to that in a minute. My point is that they're not going away, but rather they're living a renewed relationship with machinery on the shop floor. So to look at the future of this, I've been studying patents. So I need to thank my colleague Tero Karpi here for kind of suggesting me a new way to look at these objects, and also need to thank my assistant, Bronwyn Frey, for following me into a rabbit hole made of 6,000 patents that we've been analyzing, out of which we extracted a couple of hundreds which have to do with the warehouses. With Barbara Adam, I want to say that these objects kind of grant ontological status to futures which are not materially here yet, but are already produced and traded somehow. Also, with the late John Urry, I want to say that futures are of course contested, but also importantly saturated with interests, and almost literally, as he said, owned by private interests. So futures are already owned, and I think that patents are of course sort of an ideal object to look at how these futures are materially owned by these corporations. They're also masculine objects generated mostly by male engineers and lawyers, which have to do with a sort of a problem-solution approach to the world. So there is something to be said about that, which I will not maybe do today. So a few examples of technologies that may or may not materialize in the future, but that have to do with this appetite for the labor and the data of others. So number one, augmented reality user interface facilitating fulfillment. So this is a augmented reality goggles that basically generate a second layer, a visual layer of information on the screen, and then help you navigate the warehouse. So these have to do with optimizing the labor of human stowers or pickers, which are the main figures that walk around in the warehouse. Intensifying labor, so make it smoother and faster, and also generating feedback systems that they're based that datify what workers see, capture it, and use it to improve the labor process downstream. Number two, robotic grasping of items in inventory systems. So one of the most complex tasks which have to do with fulfillment, so with moving commodities around and packing commodities, is grasping. Millions of different items, different shapes, weights, and so on and so forth, so very difficult to automate. So this is a case in where Amazon kind of imagines a form of digital Taylorism, which is basically based on time motion analysis. So here you have a system where the robotic arm is fed information from sensors which detect the attributes of the item, a database of previous items which have been handled by robotic arms, a database of gripping strategies, and then also human input. So humans that may try and generate grasping strategies that are then fed to the algorithm that teaches the robotic arm how to grasp an object. So here it's, again, I think digital Taylorism in the sense that there is time motion analysis and also new forms of division of labor. In other patents, these forms of time motion analysis even enter the worker's body. I don't have time to show you those, but there is like sensors that are integrated with the worker's body to teach the machine what to do. And finally, using gestures and expressions to assist users. So this is not dissimilar to patents that also social media companies have. Like, I know Facebook has a very similar patent for a boredom detection technology where your eye movements and the way you scroll down the page detect that you're getting bored and may leave the platform, so Facebook changes what you see, so it's less likely that you will log out. So in this case, it's more about analyzing the movements that may signal to the machine that the worker is lost. They can't find the item they're looking for. So walking back and forth, facial expressions, and so on. Expressions and so on and so forth. So in this case, this is sort of a case of automation of effective and relational labor, where the machine tries to understand whether you need something, and then will ask if it thinks you need something, it will ask you, how can I help you? And this targets both workers working the shelves, but also possibly customers in the automated stores that Amazon is opening in the States, where there is no staff. So there will be many more examples of this kind of stuff. So for example, there is Many patents about smoothing out the relation between humans and robots on the shop floor. Many patents about like co-working or division of labor between human workers and robots. More political, I want to say, kind of patents, like there is one about circumventing unreliable warehouses. So the Amazon works, has this sort of distributed warehouse where like many different fulfillment centers in a certain region work together. So your order may be fulfilled by any of the fulfillment centers in a network. So the one about unreliable fulfillment centers is basically about overcoming strikes or worker sabotage where workers have misplaced items. So a warehouse becomes unreliable. Anyway, so many patents in which humans and machines cooperate. There is task standardization, time motion analysis, surveillance, and so on and so forth. So here comes my object of alternatives. Sorry, it's not really an object. It's more about the thinking about the role of human workers or workers here. So humans will be there. This is explicitly stated in Amazon patents. So some patents read like labor process theory handbooks. So I'm quoting from one. Robotic inventory handlers can be expensive and time-consuming to implement, unlike a human workforce, which is more flexible. There's problems with dexterity, grasping stuff, and so on and so forth. Especially because Amazon works in peaks, depending on consumption patterns. Very expensive to fully robotize operations where those robots are going to be used only for 2 weeks a year, not really sustainable. So, all right, so I just wanted to bring back into the picture the contested and political nature of technology and automation, of course. So I've been, of course, I just gave just a sort of a technologically determinist kind of talk, focusing on the technologies. But we shouldn't forget that there is economic factors at play, the nature of the task involved being that physical, like grasping items, or for example, the gender nature of some of the tasks that workers perform in those places. The cost of labor, and of course, a more political point about power relationships between workers and capital in those settings. So I think my object, so the worker, have to do a lot with shaping the future of work. So for example, fighting against turnover, for better health and safety measures, fighting flexibility, fighting for better wages, and also refusing the pace of work and the constraints dictated by the machine and by the forms of worker control and surveillance that are at play in those places. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Trying to find my doc.
I thought that was your object. I was like, wow.
Yeah, right. I think this is me. Yeah, that's me. Sorry. Just. Yeah. No. Yeah. Just full screen. The only trouble if you're short is you can't see me from behind here. So I'm going to try and stand to the side. I hope that doesn't mess up the mic. Yeah, so thank you for having me. It's really been a fabulous experience. I've loved going through Detroit and seeing the presentations and the site visits, and then the panels today have been wonderful. So it's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm trained as a political scientist, and sometime in the intersection of art and design on the one hand, and political economy and production on the other. I'm finishing up a book on these issues, and today I want to present the broad theme of this talk is around aesthetics and politics. So I'm not a tech person, I'm not a computer person, but I'm very interested in the aesthetics of tech, and in this instance, in the aesthetics of global supply chains, how they're visualized and how we might reimagine them. So I try to capture some of the global, the corporate presentations of supply chains. And then I've tried to come up, my alternative object is it's the last image of the talk, where I'm trying to invoke some alternative ways to imagine a counter-politics. I'll just run through the talk with the help of 5 images. Let me start with the pictogram that appeared on the Boeing website. I completely agree with the idea that we should acknowledge these. I have permissions and to do this, but I should have the attribution on the images themselves. I completely agree. But so this is from the Boeing website itself, from a blog that is posted on the website. It was put there in 2013, is still readily available today. It's been circulated very widely ever since. The Harvard Business School case studies uses this in their account of Boeing and Boeing's supply chain management struggles. It's circulated in other academic articles. I encounter it quite often in trade economists' talk at my school. So it circulates with considerable regularity. I think it's kind of a fascinating document in and of itself. So I encountered it first after having done quite several years of field work of going to visit factories in various locations, both along the US-Mexico border in the Rio Grande, in the greater New York and Boston corridor, and then a little in Hong Kong, Shanghai corridor as well. But this seemed like such a diminished account of global production that it has irked me ever since, I guess, and I've spent some time trying to think about what politics is going on in it. So there are 22 named parts, the little names associated with the pieces, 13 parts specified visually. All of them are kind of suspended in air to make the end product completely legible. We know it's a plane. It's like a child's puzzle of a plane. And this was absolutely not my experience of going into factories, that I would go in and I did my PhD at MIT, and I was given this strong methods training. You have to identify your cases and your sites and blah, blah, blah. So I was like, all right, I'm going to go in and do these sectors. I thought I would go in and do the auto sector down in the Rio Grande Valley. And so one of the first companies I went to, and I'm like, so you're in the auto sector? And they looked at me like, it just did not compute. They're like, we make sensors. These sensors go into a million different companies, million different places. It's like, so my academic legibility and theirs absolutely did not translate. So then I began to rethink what was going on with these representations. Building a jet plane globally is a daunting task. So this is for the Dreamliner, the 787 by Boeing. And I was interested in this well before the crashes. In some ways, the crashes have made my intellectual life more difficult. It was more interesting to me when they were so complex and they just flew unproblematically. Now when they're complex and crash, people are like, yeah, what do you expect? But in the Dreamliner, on their own count, and how one counts is also extremely complex, there are 2.3 million parts in the Dreamliner. So identifying all of the suppliers is extremely difficult. The production networks are complex. The recent lawsuit filed after the Ethiopian crash of a different plane, the Boeing 737 MAX, captures a little bit of that when they identified 900 companies in their liability claim. So I'm not suggesting that the pictogram represents Boeing's day-to-day management practices. In fact, Boeing relies on separate supply chain management companies, and then they're called ExoStar, and they in turn rely on a different software company to make the system work. But the pictogram and others like it, I think, do important political work, and they've become one of the familiar faces of globalization. One way to get a quick capture this a bit is if you type the phrase global supply chain into Google Images, which I think is the American visual unconscious, you get a zillion similar, so this was just one day. We could do it any day. There's many versions of different visualizations of a global supply chain are captured in this way. So what are these images doing? First and foremost, I think they reassure. Everything is in hand, literally reduced to a single page. The end product, although suspended in air, is legible. And I think I've become particularly interested in the way that this reassurance is achieved, I think is through both the radical simplification, but then in the way in which visuality and authority are brought together. So put simply, to see is to know. Companies across the corporate spectrum regularly claim transparency. Boeing, ExoStar, and the E2 Open Software Company all claim that they can see the whole, all claim to have a clear line of sight on the complexities of global production. ExoStar's website, for example, the very company Boeing uses, claims that they provide clients with global visibility by delivering complex information through a single pane of glass that provides a clear view across the supply-demand ecosystem. A little too much emphasis on visibility perhaps betrays their insecurity. But the causal claim on offer, and these are just in some ways corporate promotional materials. I understand that that's what they are, but I'm interested in reading them as such. The causal claim, I think, on offer is that seeing begets knowledge, knowledge begets authority, and authority begets control. So one of my favorite images of this sort of bringing together of visibility and authority comes from an article published in Supply Chain Quarterly in 2018. When I went to get the permission for this image, I learned that it's an Adobe stock image, which in itself is fascinating to me because it is, again, like this is just taken as a generic representation. It's not a particular. So that fact in and of itself was a little speed to the beat of my heart. The outstretched arms in this image have become, for me, a shorthand for the way of thinking about linking visuality and authority. So when I talk about this stuff, if I start going like this, it's kind of my invoking of the knowing position. The man in the image, and yes, it's almost always a man, has all the trappings of authority. He knows what he's doing. The image produces an equivalence between seeing and knowing. And it's precisely this connection between seeing and authority that I'm interested in disrupting. I want such images to be read politically as assertions rather than facts. And during my field work, somewhat to my surprise and perhaps my naivety initially when going into the field, several managers working in global corporations, and I was particularly interested in talking to middle managers and to understand how they thought about, constructed, shaped their supply chains. But many of the people that I talked to readily acknowledged, without me prompting, I didn't ask for it initially, that they could not see the whole. That multiple steps and multiple tiers of global production process they claimed remained opaque. One woman in an auto parts business put it elegantly, and this has echoes back to the morning visit in Detroit yesterday. She said, "The whole notion of a chain is misleading. That's not the world that I work in. It presumes a beginning and an end, one thing looping onto the next in a logical fashion. I work in a spider's web, a multi-tiered spider's web." I've spent considerable time pondering such remarks in which several managers have insisted that they only have partial vision. So what analytic weight should I give to such comments? And I won't spend so much time on this, but that's actually a fairly important piece of my argument and intellectual project in this is how to situate the ethnographic material in. I'm not trained as an anthropologist, so I'm very interested in what's the relationship of this kind of not knowing to other larger arguments about political economy and issues of knowing. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the question and answer, but due to time, let me just skip to the question of alternative visualizations. Because in some ways, this bit seems to me fairly, some ways I think interesting to talk about, interesting to pay attention to. But it's the alternative that is of most compelling to me. Like, how might we visualize otherwise? And so that brings me to the prompt for the conference. Initially, I wanted to find images, and I'd been doing this well before the conference. I've been mucking around in these alternative visualizations for some time. I am at work in a Borders research group which calls it an imaginative counterpolitics. And so initially I wanted to find images that resonated with my fieldwork, with the spider's web, and the strong sense of illegibility and disorientation that one often encounters when entering a factory. Now I'm less concerned with the correspondence between my experience and the images, and I'm more focused on how one might visualize partial knowledge or states of not knowing. Put differently, I want to see if I can find images that sever the presumptive ties between seeing and knowing. So I make a shift to draw on the arts. I could elaborate that, but I'm not going to here. And it's specifically on the work of Anish Kapoor and Daniel Lieber Skins, the architect. I draw on them for inspiration. I should say right away that neither of them has anything to do with supply chain. Well, they probably do in their work, actually, but in the work intensely. But in the content of these projects are not about supply chain. So I'm doing taking the license of a radical recontextualization of their work. I don't know if anyone saw the Anish Kapoor exhibition in New York and Berlin, in the Guggenheim in New York and Berlin. It's an amazing piece called Memory, if it's really worth looking up. I only have a slide at the end of the talk, which I'll show if people want it. But that was really about scale and not being able to see, not seeing. So the piece took up the full room in both locations, and it was sited so that one could never get a bird's eye view. You could always only see part. And it's a really amazing experience. Still, just to look at stills, and there are a couple of videos of the installation, but the sense of visceral frustration, I think, really speaks to some of the things maybe that came up at the lunch yesterday, of the kind of bodily way in which positions of authority and panoramic visions and seeing the whole that we take for granted. So there's all this way in which if you look at the work, that you really, he never lets you see the whole. It's a really wonderful, wonderful project, I think. But I want to talk here a bit more, show you a couple of Daniel Lieber Skins drawings. He's a renowned architect. He's sort of known most recently for building the new, I regret to call it the Freedom Tower. But his early drawings are of particular interest to me, much more than the buildings. He did two series of drawings, one called Micromegas that he did in 1979, and the second Chamber Works that he did in 1983. And it's interesting that he did the Chamber Works drawings while he was the director of, what is it called? Cranbrook? Yeah, Cranbrook, not far from here. So there's some interesting loop between those two. Let me just give you these two images. So this first one is from Lieber Skins' Micromegas. And so he has this series of 11 drawings that become 12 prints that are actually really famous amongst many art and designers. And they are, I think of them as meditations on complexity. I like the little openings at the bottom of the page. The viewer is invited in. There are small gaps where the lines thin out, and I can imagine finding a pathway through the thicket. But this is not a wayfinding drawing. This is not an architectural plan to build from. Rather, I think we are asked to tolerate or perhaps appreciate the complexity that we do not fully comprehend. There is no way to understand this as a sort of cartographic map. And this resonated very much for me with the spider's web accounts of globalization. But let me finish with the last image from his second series of drawings called Chamber Works that he did in 1983. This is from a series, I think, of 28 works, I think. For my purposes, I think these drawings are fantastic. They've become like a real touchstone for me. And in many ways, I think, echo back to Mary's questions about invisibility. I especially like the way that in the center of each of these drawings, I'm only going to show you two, that there is a blank spot or spots. There is no mapping of the whole. Large swaths are left for us to not see. We do not know what's going on there. And apart from admiring the aesthetics, I hope the drawings will stick with you. The task I'm working through as I go back to New York and finish writing this chapter, and that is the thing I'd like to talk about here, is so what's the political consequences of mapping globalization in these ways, with these blank spots and empty spaces? I haven't fully worked this out, but I'd say that let me just point to three ideas that I'm toying with, and some of which resonates with this morning's panel. First, I don't think it's necessarily a progressive politics. One response to the thicket, to the blind spots, can be a retreat to what you know. And so I think that Trump and Brexit might be seen as a pulling back from a global gaze into a sort of nationalist enclave in which you know where the lines are drawn. So that one interests, you know, I think there have to be different interpretations to counter that. I think that's a strong narrative that we're living in right now. But the second thing is, I think if you want to produce at scale, which many of these companies do, most of these, they're not willing to yet to retreat to in a Trumpian world. And so I think of them as having to work across these blind spots. They're having to navigate that. And so how might you manage, if you're a manager, how might you manage differently with that in mind? If you're a worker, how might it change your ways of thinking about your solidarities? And for how might it shape our politics? So I think the first thing links very much to the discussion of skill. I think this issue of where skill is, what it is, who defines it, what number it's given, I think is absolutely central. And the unskilled are often dumped in the white spaces. So I think that there's kind of a geography of skill that could be unpacked through this. So I'd love to follow up on that from the conversation this morning. Then there was a little bit of discussion around sort of community co-ops and some sort of language of sharing in one of the panels in the morning yesterday. And I think that this project brings me to center issues of disagreement and difference at the center of any kind of commoning project, a common production project, or and so that I am interested in the ways in which the acknowledgement of country, as it would be called in Australia yesterday, and the both of Sarita and Jill brought that up for us in the sessions, brings to the fore that we are not just necessarily a shared we. It problematizes that from the start in the same way that I think the blank spots do in this, that you can't simply resort to knowing the whole. And I'm very interested in what a politics of knowing parts rather than everything might entail. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. So this is my object of alternatives, which I'll come to in about 4 to 5 minutes. But I guess I'll try and weave in thoughts and comments which are very much related to yesterday's panels and today's panel, the first panel that happened. I'm Nupur. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Irvine in informatics. I am in the process of writing up my dissertation, and a lot of it has to do with gig work and gig workers, in specific empirical pieces, but also reflections on the future of work, both as a rhetoric and as a theme, and what does it mean to think about the future of work in very personal and intimate ways when I research communities and talk to people who are working, and also then what does it mean to imagine somebody else's future of work. A lot of my work has led me back to India, where I'm from. So I'll just try and share some comments, reflections, and news items that have, and in fact today's first panel was like super useful and instrumental in helping me piece those together, because some of my frustrations, sort of very crudely put, were that I wasn't able to piece together more meta discussions about minimum wage, fairness of work, imagining sort of a globally fair work future for the gig workers that I was going back to in India constantly. And at some point I sort of took seriously the charge of saying that if there are possible alternatives to the way gig work is being mapped out and defined and imagined right now, and the way people have to work within gig work platforms, and how it's to some extent clearly exploitative. But when I go back to my field sites, there are people who continue enrolling in these gig work platforms and doing that kind of work. How do I reconcile these two? So that's one. And also the bit where, you know, I guess it sounds simplistic, or it sounded weird to be able to say, like, go back and say, well, unions don't work in the context that I'm looking at. And I took that charge seriously, and then kind of went back and started interviewing more recently people and asking them like pointed questions about, you know, what would it mean to collectivize, and why aren't you collectivizing in the ways that I think collectivizing works? So those have been interesting questions to ask, and like good answers to get. And I want to take it back to the first panel that we were discussing, because I think there's what it brought me to one day, you know, one of these discussions of talking to workers and saying, well, why don't you do this? And receiving some amount of pushback, and like really realizing that I've become the classic subject of like trying to animate the subaltern voice, right? Like trying to really actually enact the whole fantasy of like going back to the global South worker and saying, why don't you do this? And this would empower you. And receiving all the answers that I, to some extent, already knew, but I had to sort of ask and get them for myself. And moving, like jumping a little bit from that to actual news items, which occupy my mind as somebody who works and lives for a bit in California, is all the global circuits of innovation and enterprise and engineering work, which are, I think, actually the background to this story, right? So some of it, just to like throw news items at you, obviously South Asian engineers and immigrant engineers make a big chunk of the Silicon Valley workforce. And if you think about it, in the calls to the Tech Worker Coalition, in actually scanning through, and this is it's almost a bit of like a racialized exercise if you think about it, but I actually scrolled through the list of people who signed a particular petition. I think it was the Google, Microsoft, etc. workers. And again, sort of being, both frustrated but not really surprised that like there weren't really so many South Asian workers who even signed the petition, and trying to find my own answers of like, well, why won't you do this? And there are multiple answers to that. Those who work as South Asianists, or those who work from the global South vantage point, as method, as site, as everything, already kind of know the answers to like why there isn't a pure ideological politic, or even like an empowered, agential worker taking authority and acting in the ways that we want to. But that's one news item. There's also a connected news item, I think, that came more recently about Facebook. The VP of Facebook, some VP of Facebook, who's actually also South Asian, coming up and announcing that now contractors will be paid a minimum wage, at least in North America. I might be misrepresenting this a little bit, but it's something to the effect of either minimum wage or an increased payment. And he started by saying that at least to the workers in North America, and so on and so forth. And my frustration, but not so much surprise, was that why would you do that only to a certain region of workers, and why wouldn't you extend at least the thought about some kind of work parity, pay parity to the rest of the world? And not just that, but the fact that I'm actually thinking of and I'm seeing a South Asian high-tech worker write this memo out was even more frustrating. Like, oh, what do we think about workers' solidarities and collectivities and so on and so forth? But as somebody, again, who kind of shuttles back to thinking about my own work and is unable to talk in such global, sweeping, or uniform ways about like humans or human workers or tech workers, and to me it was very apparent that if I want to talk about a South Asian high-tech worker who does this kind of an announcement and who occupies this positionality, it's a lot about class and caste before anything else. And so if I wanted to even animate again the fantasy of collectivizing and making sense and awareness to people who occupy these high rungs of Silicon Valley, who are actually brown people, what would I say to them? Like, how would I ask them to think about, the disadvantaged, underprivileged, underserved, whatever, exploited workers who not only occupy the global South, like India, but also are in Silicon Valley and across the United States? So I don't really have an answer for this, but these are contradictions that I'm unable to let go of, which constantly push me to, I guess, unpack the we of platform work all the time. And which is why, at least in my own project, I'm never able to talk about Indian gig workers in absolutely universal terms of gig work. But at the same time, the other thing I want to reflect on, which is again not so much a solution or an answer, and it's in fact my complaint to the rapidly solutionized space of digital labor at large. Like, we're always only thinking in terms of modes of crisis, urgency, and solutions, which isn't a bad thing, but I think it needs more space to articulate differential power hierarchies and how people occupy the space. And so I want to go back to that and just think about India's national context a little bit. So just in terms of the affective charge, something that's been occupying my mind since yesterday, but is a national conversation in India right now, is the question of unemployment. For context, what gets, again, animated as the ghost of the global South in all conversations, but isn't really ever the topic or the method or the lens of conversation, is this problem, is that, even just in economic terms of conversation, India is a country of like 1 billion plus people, whose average age right now is like 23 years old or something. All of the African continent right now, I think, is the average age of 19 or something, right? So it's one of those truisms that we keep throwing around about like, oh, but this is actually the majority of the world. And if we wanted to talk from that vantage point, how would the ways in which we talk even about precarity or about fairness or about informality, how would all of these things change drastically if we wanted to attend to these things? Except I found myself constantly being asked questions when I made presentations and being sort of pushed into the more region studies, area studies, and ethnic studies domains, because somehow the understandings were that, oh, you're actually talking about how gig work unfolds in India. But if you stay with me and follow through all the past news items that I just mentioned about the histories of Silicon Valley work and so on and so forth, these are actually all connected to some extent. And not just that, I think what's most important is that when I go back to India and do all of this gig work research, there's a very, very strong articulation of a consumption culture within which gig work is firmly situated. So the people who pay for, your Olas and Ubers and food delivery services or app-based beauticians or what have you, I can't talk about them without reckoning with the aspirational power and upward mobility and so on of this, not emerging, it's been around for a long time, but a young global professional class, which actually looks to Silicon Valley all the time. So it's about drinking that nitro coffee in Bangalore. And it's really that, it's, like you are, like, I used to do these personas with people, and they were great exercises because it was like, this person goes to a third wave coffee roaster and drinks this nitro coffee in a particular part of Bangalore, and naturally prefers taking an Uber ride to an Ola ride because it's also a marker of their class status. And then, thinks about it in terms of convenience, but also a constant class performance of being at home and ordering all of these services and being serviced and being perhaps able to forget that they, live in India, which is constantly thought of as a place of deficiency or underserved people and so on and so forth. And they've made their little Californias. There's actually a place in Bangalore called Kamanhattan. So it's a place called Kamanhalli, which is now occupied by a lot of people who had to move back from New York or wherever in America and have made a little Manhattan for themselves, apparently so. And there are these, all of you know of WeWorks, right? So WeWork, again, totally sort of makes an aesthetic inside its space, wherever in Bangalore, where people who've actually had to move back because of President Trump's policies and so on and so forth, the H-1B suspensions, all now continue to work at WeWork with Silicon Valley companies, in their minds constantly performing and telling themselves, like not in a delusional way, but in a sense of futurity, that I'm almost there. Like I'm still connected to California. And that's why I guess like I've been thinking about all of these things. So the first panel got me really thinking about what it means to talk and study gig work or platform work at all without being able to account for the political economy of global consumption and also global work and immigrant work within it. So it's not so much about the gig workers. And I also kind of got tired of kind of narrating the story of like, how does someone Uber in Bangalore? I mean, sure. And I'll then quickly, in the interest of time, and I'll answer a little bit about, so I guess in setting up this field, I did want to move away from like any kind of purity of what it might mean to unionize, collectivize, and so on. I would love to talk about my experiments in figuring out collective action and resistance. So I did actually go to different sets of gig workers and did surveys with them, did interviews with them, and asked them all those like naive, weird questions about like, why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? And I found my answers, and I'm happy to talk about those. But I think my objects and my sites are always at the risk of using those bad metaphors like corrupted, post-colonial, not really broken, but never like there in the formal sense of thinking about them. And so this is a ledger, a notebook, which every ride-hailing driver, at least in field sites that I've been in different cities in India, drivers keep, and they keep it as like a counter dashboard to the dashboard. So it's because drivers don't really have any faith or trust in the numbers that they're being shown in the ride-hailing apps. And so they do their own set of numerical calculations on a daily basis and kind of come at an account of what they should have earned. And this is kind of important because if the Uber dashboard doesn't really match with what they've earned, then they make the call to the customer care and kind of figure it out, like what happened. So there's that one. I'll just quickly finish in the interest of time. There's that one point about just expanding our thinking about resistance or fighting back against platforms, not just with regard to human actors, but also considering the role of infrastructure and subverting infrastructure and artifacts, and how artifacts like these are actually situated and help workers figure things out. And the way I've called it is making work for them. So how do you make work viable in situations where you can't really afford to abandon work, or you're in the constant zone of waiting to find better work or better alternatives, especially when there's a larger national anxiety about being unemployed, about getting out of the market, about being left out of it. So how do you think about that? And the second thing I wanted to point out was again like this larger role of situating precarity, right? So if this was the precarious or the kind of precarious beginnings that I've tried to offer today are the ones that we're talking about, then what would it mean to seriously say that Global South is method and that Global South is framework? And that a friend of mine said, well, it's not so much Global South, but majority of the world. But then what would it mean to start seriously thinking and at least dismissing the we or the uniformity or the universal when we start talking about platform works. And I think it goes back to a little bit of the critique of a kind of discourse of responsibility that is like circulating all the time. It's not bad. It's a discourse of responsible consumption, and it's a discourse of thinking through our positionalities of where we stand and how we work, which is great. But it perhaps also has to make room for people who don't necessarily want to think in the same register. Because my workers, my informants are also thinking of their own lives, so it's also the future of their lives, figuring out like ways to actually make money and be upwardly mobile. And if so, then how would we make space for somebody who isn't necessarily thinking in the register of redistribution of wealth or social justice, so much as just survival, but also like having a bigger say, like being more politically enfranchised and being more capable to participate in their local, national, whatever context. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you. Can I do a switcheroo of the computer?
All right. Oops, sorry. All right, thank you everybody for listening. I know it's the end of a long day of awesome talks, and thank you to the organizers, Sylvia and Cindy in particular, and to my wonderful co-panelists with whom I have a lot of shared interests, and I'm really excited to see where the conversation goes. I'm going to be talking about some similar themes, but I hope in a little bit of a different way. My name is Maggie Jack, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Information Science at Cornell. And today I'm going to talk about some of my research that I've done with tuk-tuk drivers in Cambodia, where I've been doing the bulk of my research as a PhD student, and I've been working on and off there since January 2014. We hear a lot about the totalizing capacity of logistics, these doom and gloom stories on the news and on Black Mirror, and it feels like academics and other analysts have kind of brought these stories into our own research, and I've heard a lot of dystopian stories, and this is an image that I took when I was at UNICEF, where they have a warehouse similar to the Amazon warehouse, one of these very highly automated warehouses. And don't get me wrong, I think that there is a lot to be worried about. We should be fighting for antitrust regulation on Amazon and better conditions for logistics workers all over the world. But I've also come to believe through doing some of this research in a lot of these spaces that we as analysts also need to tell different kinds of stories, stories that show the real difficulty of logistics, the partiality of systems, the brokenness and bad UIs of logistical software, cases when flights are missed, boxes are forgotten, and other stories like that. My imperative to tell these kinds of stories is based in part on my commitment to feminist forms of scholarship that are grounded and specific. Doreen Massey has been hugely influential, and more recently I've been inspired by Sarah Elwood's call to pay attention to what she calls glitch politics, these points of resistance and the not quiteness of control. So I see similar kinds of techno-dystopian stories now being told about the ride-hailing apps in Phnom Penh and their effects on tuk-tuk drivers. And it's true. It might be that traditional tuk-tuk drivers will go out of business in the next few years. Work is really competitive, so drivers lead precarious lives, even when business is good. Sometimes tuk-tuk drivers can make about $20 a day, but they can make nothing if business is bad. Many of the tuk-tuk drivers in Phnom Penh come from the provinces, looking for promises of better wages and an opportunity to send money home to their families. The reality of work, though, is often daunting. Some are homeless, living only in their tuk-tuks, leading to both uncomfortable living situations and other risks like theft. And work is also getting a lot harder for them with the rising competition of the apps. So I was lucky to be able to do some research in the fall of 2017 in Phnom Penh in conjunction with my partner, Poen Kao, who is the director of Phnom Penh's Informal Economy Union. And we were introduced through a mutual friend and had a common interest in documenting how ride-hailing apps are changing working conditions for tuk-tuk drivers in Phnom Penh. And he is interested from the programmatic perspective, and I was interested more from the research and analysis perspective. And we've worked together doing interviews and focus groups for a number of months at the end of 2017. And then at the beginning of 2018, Poen and I worked together to present this work to the Informal Union and then work to integrate some of it into their programmatic activities. So I think, for one, IDEA is an amazing organization and that Poen is an incredible organizer. He's doing things like negotiating with the government to have an opt-in social security package for all informal workers in Phnom Penh, so tuk-tuk drivers as well as street vendors. And in itself, IDEA could be, an object of alternatives. And it was a hugely amazing opportunity for me to be able to partner with them. And I wish Poen himself could be here to talk a little bit about their work, but I am glad that we have other organizers who can talk to us about that later on today, who share commitments, I think. And I'd like to share just a couple of findings from our work. So we found that the impacts of new ride-hailing apps in Cambodia must be considered only within the context of huge amounts of change, modernization, urbanization, and resulting broader infrastructural change in Phnom Penh. So over the past 6 years that I've been working in Cambodia, the economy has grown at 7% each year. And of course, the effects of this growth are hugely uneven. This has included the rise of the internet, which between 2013 and 2017 has grown from 6% to 74%, and the rise in ride-hailing apps, which has grown in popularity quite substantially in the past 3 years. And though this case does show the ways that the advance of ride-hailing apps is making the working lives of tuk-tuk drivers more precarious, I found that the tuk-tuk drivers themselves lump the impacts of these ride-hailing apps within the broader set of challenges that they're facing. Oops, sorry. The broader sets of challenges that they're facing from, sorry. Oh yeah, good idea. So one of the other big changes is that in 2016, the first citywide air-conditioned buses were launched with financial support from the Chinese government. And in the spring of 2017, the bus expanded to 5 cross-city lines. And many of the tuk-tuk drivers told me that their customers have started to use these instead of regular tuk-tuks. Other drivers explain that the new Indian style, what they call the Indian style tuk-tuk, brought new competition, and these were first introduced to Phnom Penh in 2016. The Indian model costs about $2,500 or $3,000 new, and they also run on liquefied petroleum gas, which is a big change. It is a lot cheaper when you actually have the tuk-tuk, but the traditional tuk-tuk costs only $900 in addition to the cost of the moto, which can range from a couple $100s to about $1,000. But the drivers who already own their tuk-tuks find it really challenging to upgrade to the new Indian-style tuk-tuk. Rapid change is also something that Cambodia has been working with for a long time. Some tuk-tuk drivers seem, though nervous for new changes, also somewhat mentally prepared for them. Many say that it's really possible that there could be a huge change in transport options, and they refer to the Siklo, which was the most popular form of transport in 1993 when Cambodia first opened to a liberal economic system from socialism. And in the past it's only been in the past 2 decades that Siklos largely went out of business and tuk-tuks became the primary form of transport. So our second set of findings was that group structures help tuk-tuk drivers manage the negative consequences that they're facing from the digital tools, but all these other infrastructural changes which they listed. So typically in Phnom Penh, drivers are part of informal neighborhood groups, which are located at the place where they park. Usually this is a specific landmark, so something like a hotel, the airport, the street corner, etc. And this informal neighborhood tuk-tuk association is always cited as a powerful resource in managing new competition from ride-hailing apps, and more generally helping drivers manage challenges in their work. So these informal structures are usually tied to older forms of kinship, so things like being from the same family, maybe from the same village in the province, and it's often cited as being more important to them than their formal union membership if they're a member of IDEA. These associations have many advantages for drivers. They are the first line of support when a driver has a problem, most commonly an accident. They also govern how passengers are received. So this is actually outside of the apartment I share with my partner, and it's at the Riverside area, Phnom Penh, and so I know these tuk-tuk drivers really well. It's one of the most popular tourist areas in Phnom Penh outside of Street 178, and some of them are unionized and some of them are not unionized. And they have a group of 24 who sit there. Some of them are there at some times of the day and some are not. But within a period, they each get a number from 1 to 24, and they receive a customer in order of their number. So if a driver declines a customer for whatever reason, they actually need to wait until their number is reached again, which can sometimes take all day. I think it is also really important to point out some of the exclusivity inherent to these groups. So it can be difficult to join one of these informal associations. One group of tuk-tuk drivers, which I interviewed, who park at a large hotel nearby the airport and usually give rides to the people who live and stay in that hotel, said to me, "We formed a group and we don't let other people park here, only us. Then we negotiate with the hotel. The hotel allows us to park here." So when there are enough drivers who are already in that particular area, no new drivers are allowed into the old groups. And if there is a need for a new driver, the driver can be introduced, but they're usually family members or close friends. In some groups, members have to pay a monthly fee. So by the airport, for example, which is a very desirable parking location, they have to pay $5 to park per month. I've also heard a lot of xenophobic language from tuk-tuk drivers. The most aggravated recently has been the drivers' perceptions of the Indian-style tuk-tuk, and they always encouraged riders to ride in the Khmer-style tuk-tuk. Neighborhood groups also try to manage differences between users and non-users of the apps. So within all of the neighborhood groups with whom I talked, the drivers try to divide customers equally between them, whether or not the customers are hailing the tuk-tuk physically or using a ride-hailing app. They report that this management helps manage the threat of the new apps. And in one neighborhood group, a driver told me that 3 of the 20 members are usually using Camgo, which is one of the apps popular in Phnom Penh, but the vast majority aren't yet using it. The ones who do use Camgo do not have a big advantage over those who don't, this is according to the group, because they still work in these shifts and they keep their place in the rotation. In another neighborhood group, they think that the driver using Pass app might be getting a little bit more business, but all in all, they think their monthly incomes end up being about the same. And this is Pon. This is a picture. Pon is in the middle there, who is my partner for this project. Though the drivers, okay, we'll move on. So this brings me to my object of alternatives, which is the street corner. And I think that the street corner, for me, represents a brick and mortar symbol of this kind of informal association. It's located in a geographical space, tied to historical forms of kinship, powerfully resistant to perils of rapid globalization and urbanization, but holding on to sticky forms of provincialism. The street corner also acts as a metaphor for the variety of resilient spaces popping up all over the city. As rapid digitization, urbanization, and globalization makes work more uncertain and competitive, and as the internet becomes a place widely understood to be unsafe due to increasing state information controls, oppositional or marginalized communities of all sorts, including, one might say, the tuk-tuk drivers, are maintaining or establishing live and in-person places of trust, collaboration, and independence. Thank you.
respond briefly, I would say, because we're running a little bit late. Christian, do you want to?
Up to you, sure. Thank you so much to a wonderful panel. I mean, I feel like I really don't have anything that I can tell these people, right? Because it's fantastic work and it's very interesting. So I guess I'll just kind of try for some context that I think they already know. I don't know, but maybe it's a way to reframe it. So, I mean, I think a lot of us have had a bad job in our lives, right? I mean, and we can't really maybe compare to coltan miner or uranium miner or maybe even tuk-tuk driver, but I had a bad job when I was growing up. And one of the features of the bad job was that there was a middle manager above me. This was when I was in high school. And there was a middle manager above me that had a binder in a desk drawer. And whenever anything came up in the job, the middle manager would open the desk drawer and look at the binder and do what it said. And I know some people must have had this experience in their lives, right? So my contextualization, I guess, is about the title of the panel, which is about algorithms. So I think, you know, my middle manager was an algorithm, right? So that was an algorithm. That was a robot. That was a mixture of, you know, human and machine that was doing that to me in that job. And I think one of the nice things about the panel is that it kind of proves the title of the panel in the presentations. So one way to think about the panel is you could say, oh, this is a panel about what algorithms or computing or the internet or something are doing to us, or automation, right? And this is the, you know, the future of work in that way. But obviously, it's also what we're doing to algorithms and computing, you know, to make it do those things to us. So it's both directions there. But you know, algorithms. What we saw in the panel. So just to kind of recap, what I got from the panel is we got, like, in the first presentation, we had this interesting mixing between humans and robots that struck me as not like a smooth mixing, but a problematic mixing, where there's some difficult interchangeability and replacement. And we got, with the second talk, we got this idea that we're all enmeshed in a kind of unknowable system. I like that quite a bit. It's sort of, here we are, able only to see part of it. And then, you know, in the third and the fourth, we really saw the global reach of the system we're enmeshed in. And also in the third, we had this idea of an orientation toward consumption that was like, I really like the phrase, to be serviced. Like, the orientation toward consumption is that we will be serviced by the apps or the workers or something like that. And so I was thinking about that in terms of algorithms. So algorithms, right, is a really old word. It's been recently adopted by computing, but it was in Chaucer. It was in the Canterbury Tales. If you look it up in the dictionary definition is procedure, right? So is it procedures that are doing this to us? I mean, I want to go back to some old ideas that I'm often reminded of in these conversations. I mean, one idea is the idea of bureaucracy, thanks to our buddy Max Weber, 1904. Another idea, cyborg, which you might associate with Donna Haraway in 1986, if you're in this room. So Max Weber had this idea of bureaucracy, and one key part of bureaucracy, like what counts as a bureaucracy, one key part is procedure. That's one of his parts, is you had to have rules. But he had these other parts, and you also see them in our conversations. You had to have standardization, you had to have a division of labor, you had to have a hierarchy, and it had to be impersonal. And it just strikes me that you know, he was trying to describe this industrial transformation. And so for those of us who work in this area, you often get this question, so what's new about today? And we've grappled with that in the earlier panel as well. What's new about today? And you know, Weber is trying to understand an industrial change, but here we're trying to understand, I mean, possibly it's been argued a post-industrial change. I don't know if you buy that. But it seems, you know, again, this more sense of a deepening continuity. Like, it seems like, oh, here we are, 1904. This is what's happening. Rules, standardization, division of labor, hierarchy, impersonal. Sounds right. So Weber is sometimes misread into saying that he really liked bureaucracy. I don't know. Some of the people who write about Weber have caricatured this as the quote, like, Max Weber : management consultant. And so it's like, well, you know, because he has this idea that the ideal bureaucracy is rational and efficient, but it's not. I mean, if you read Weber, he doesn't like it. I mean, he says bureaucracy is domination, and you know, it's sometimes contrasted with what he was contrasting is other forms of organization. Where he said, well, you know, in other forms of organization, we had widespread corruption and we had patronage, and people exercised their power, you know, based on demonstrating their whims as opposed to rationality. So here I am in charge because I'm in charge, and I'll just do what I like. So some people took him to mean like, okay, it's great that we have bureaucracy now because it will get rid of those problems of corruption and whims, and everything will be rational. But for him, I think it was just domination. It's domination one way, domination another way, not saying one's better than the other, but that's just sort of how it goes. And so, you know, struggling with the sort of echoes of Weber, I think, wow, this panel reminds me so much of 1904. I mean, it just seems so much like the same as opposed to the different. But, you know, I was then also thinking about Donna Haraway, because Donna Haraway in 1986 popularized the idea of the cyborg, or a hybrid of a machine and an organism. And I mean, she says it's not a new thing then, right? A cyborg, Weber was talking about the hybrid of the machine and the organism too. Maybe it was the factory. But the reason I think about Haraway is that when I think about a cyborg, I mean, the title of our panel is really about how there's a speed and a scale dimension to the addition of computing. But perhaps computing just stands in for any machine, right? And when I think about the cyborg, it seems to me that's how that happens. And so, I mean, I think, again, I'm not telling the people on the panel anything they don't know, but I was also thinking about Karen Levy's argument that whenever anyone tries to sell you on the idea that there's automation and that people are replaced by machines, what you should really think about is the way that people and machines are merged, because the sort of thin wedge of AI or of automation or of the internet or of computing is really the little ways in which the machine becomes you and you become it, and it merges into your life, right? So I just, and again, I don't think this is in contradiction to what we heard. It's just agreeing. And then I'll close by, I mean, another quote that I really like about this that I think is consistent with what I've been saying is actually from Nathan Ensminger, who's here. But Nathan Ensminger said at another event, he said, you know, computers are essentially labor-saving devices. So if you want to understand computers, they're labor-saving devices. How you feel about that depends on how you feel about the labor that is saved. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for really stimulating presentations. I really enjoyed them. And I think I want to sort of build a little bit on what Christian was just saying. One of the things that really stuck with me across your presentations was this question of temporality. So Alessandro talked about, you know, I think you called it the appetite for data, sort of an extension of appetite for labor invoking Marx, right? So we began the conversation with seemingly this is like the same old, right? Business as usual. I'm reminded of, you know, colonial tropes of master and control. In Vicky's presentation, you know, these sort of entrepreneurial and corporate imagery of, you know, seeing, mapping, that all seems very, very familiar. We've been there before so many times, right? The sort of yearning for gaining control, this yearning to see, right, a very masculine, very white project. So there's something seemingly old going on, you know, something that's about repetition. We've been there before. And I think we've also seen this in some of the, in both Maggie's and Newport's project, you know, where sort of technological promise seems to now have shifted actors, you know. So Maggie, in your example, there was, you mentioned Chinese investment in infrastructure building, in part to enable, you know, a project that is building a post-socialist modernity. You know, we've been there before in the 1980s in China, so is now China the prototype for that very remake, you know, in your field sites in Cambodia. And also in Newport's examples, you know, I think you brought back these questions about what is at stake in an anthropological or ethnographic project, right? What is our positionality and our voice? And so I was really struck by that, you know, I think, and this is also something that maybe that becomes visible in these sort of like, you know, sort of techno fantasies right now of like regaining control, you know. I think in some ways this sort of appetite for data, I think, comes out of a particular moment of anxiety that is a very Western anxiety and a very modernist kind of anxiety. So what I mean by that, so even though all of you sort of talked about sort of repetition and sort of, you know, reminding us sort of the endurance of colonial tropes, right, and colonial projects, even in today, there's also something very, very historically specific about what all of you have been sharing with us. And I was reminded of things like, you know, sort of the Silicon Valley promise, you know, that is now sort of, you know, that moved maybe from social media, now attached to data. that sort of is continuing sort of this old promise of scale, and yet there seems to be something more at stake for the white programmers, you know, who promise, or something else seems at stake for the white programmer. There's sort of an anxiety, a shared anxiety over that business as usual doesn't work anymore. Silicon Valley increasingly attacked by the media. You know, it's not anymore just people in this room, you know, who challenge Silicon Valley for what it's doing, but it's really become, that critique has gone mainstream, right? So in that moment, as critique has gone more mainstream, you know, in this moment of like, you know, fear, anxiety, that is now shared by those who were previously, you know, in a very privileged position. You know, the feminization now not only of you know, labor that is mostly performed by women of color, but now also feminization of labor performed by white men. And I think that is so what makes all of what you have been saying so historically specific, at the same time as you're reminding us of the endurance of these older tropes, right? And sort of this yearning for control that still, that I think appears exactly in this moment right now again, because there is a sort of a proliferating sense amongst a very privileged class coming out of the tech industry of, you know, fear for their own jobs, fear for their own futures. And I think that's why you also do see phrases like the future of work, and why there is, you know, cachet around that. So one thing that then I think all of you did really as well was sort of point us though to other ways of noticing. So I was really reminded of Anna Tsing's work in all of your presentations. I think all of you have offered ways of noticing differently, and this in fact was a theme also that really the organizers took into this workshop, you know, so I'm really excited that you guys brought that up. So we heard things, you know, Maggie talked about broken things and gaps. Vicky talked about the impossibility to understand, the impossibility to even return to seeing the whole. There was, I love the phrase that Newport had, I'm this sort of like question, this sort of phrase of I'm almost there, you know, this constant zone of longing, and that constant zone of longing, of waiting, you know, which, you know, is a form of exploitation, especially for, you know, sort of like bodies of color. I think then was sort of taken up for me nicely in Maggie's work when you return us to the street corner, right, as a sticky provincialization, I think you put it. So there was stickiness, there was inability to see and grasp, right? So this very sort of like promise to regain control. You all have pointed us how that masculine promise, you know, endures, and yet you find in these moments of stickiness, in this impossibility, the impossibility to see, you find alternatives, and I thought that was really fascinating. And I'll end here, and we could get a couple of responses from the presenters, and then we'll open it fairly quickly for questions from the audience.
I just want to quickly add to the point, to the panel's title, which is about the speed discourse as well. And Lily already spoke about Sarah Sharma's work yesterday, but she has, I think in her introduction to the book, a really nice critique of the like sort of Virilio's sort of speed discourse, and turning the question away from an eventuality that often informs tech conversations, either on the side of technologists saying that the train is leaving the station, and if you don't get on board, then you'll miss it. But also on the other side of like different kinds of other temporal metaphors. And she kind of says like, what if we started instead looking at the temporal capacities of different individuals within that matrix or the geography, and see how people can enact different things or politics based on the temporal capacities that they have. So I thought that I'll just add to it.
So very quickly, I want to maybe add the one thing about the temporality issue, which is the future-oriented kind of nature of many of these processes. So in my own research, for example, it's the ability, Amazon's ability to, or attempt at forecasting consumption, even using weather forecast. It's going to rain tomorrow. People will order more. We'll need more workers in the warehouse tomorrow. So there is this even algorithmic kind of tension towards the future, which then folds back into the lived experience of workers, which generating these frictions and mismatches between the times of work and the times of life of all those workers. So I think looking at all this stuff in terms of temporalities is actually pretty interesting to, as a way to kind of dig up some of those frictions. I'm going to keep it super short because I know we're late.
Yeah, maybe we should go straight to the floor.
Yeah, we can open it up. I might.
I don't know who was first because I was looking down.
Okay, thank you. That was a very interesting panel. I'm going to ask two questions and then make a comment. So my first question actually is tying together the last panel and this panel, and it came out quite a bit in Nupur's presentation as well. I was wondering how we could think beyond the tropes of visibility and invisibility as binaries, and if you could all collectively help us think through questions of hypervisibility. What happens when certain kinds of workers, maybe distasteful workers, workers who have right-wing politics, for instance, I'm thinking specifically about India now, are the very workers we want to organize? What is our role? When do they become hypervisible? In what ways? When do black women's bodies become hypervisible in the scenes that you're talking about? My second question is specifically, I'd like each of you to talk a little bit about gender and how gender politics works across your cases. So in the case of tuk-tuk drivers or Ola and Uber drivers in India, what role does gender play in organizing forms of exclusions, but also in solidarity? So I'm just going to say something from my own research, which is one of the reasons why the South Asian VP in Silicon Valley is not in solidarity with the gig workers in India. Yes, it's questions of class and caste, and also the way those express itself through a certain idea of women's liberation, right? So that the middle-class Indian woman who has arrived through consumption experiences that arrival as a form of freedom. And so how can we take that into consideration when we think about solidarity? In the case of Lieber Skins and Kapur, I'm wondering what are the consequences of thinking through a very masculinist architect vision of complexity for the project that's being worked out. And then for these patents, is Amazon imagining a genderless body or a perfectly abled body? How does that work in the way that surveillance and capacity is imagined in these futures? And then finally, I just wanted to make a comment on the algorithm. I think everyone in this room knows the term algorithm comes from the name of a mathematician who we believe was born in what's now Uzbekistan in the 12th century. That's how it makes its way into Chaucer. And I think it's keeping again with Nupur's point, it's important to bring those global histories into the conversation from the beginning. And algorithm is from his name, which was it's not algorithm, but it's al-Qurami, which people heard as algorithm. And in the early translations, I suppose I don't read Latin, but it was translated. It became the word for digit. So how can we even complicate the history of the algorithm itself in the way that we're thinking about its current formation? Sorry, that was a lot, but I've been waiting for a while to ask a question.
Yeah, let's collect a couple. Yeah.
Thank you for the. I actually wanted to ask about the scale and speed in the title of the panel, for instance. Appears to me to stand on a foundation or the infrastructures of trust, which Nupur brought up in her object as well as this thing that keeps account or distrusts the dashboard, the accounting of things. And in a previous moment, we've seen that even with people, at least in the South Asian context, actually writing down the duration of their calls when their prepaid mobile account balances were getting reduced and stuff like that. So there's a longer history of thinking about this. And the way that's always been talked about is as deficient subjects who somehow don't understand that will all be okay. That, in the end, it'll add up and it will be fine, right? So for me, I think another sort of common thread between the talks was this sort of what regimes of trust are in play. Because even Victoria's presentation with those, the diagrams that show the different parts coming in for the 737 or whatever, it is the image is also at one level a trust artifact, that you trust in this harmoniousness of it all. So if we can talk about other regimes of trust being developed, like in Nupur's case, I'd be interested in talking about what sort of regimes of trust are the workers themselves developing in terms of thinking about making work for them, right?
I've been chatting with folks in the autonomous vehicle design field, and I'm fascinated by the way they're picking up on sort of Marxist discourse. You know, this is about helping out exploited workers and eliminating those jobs. But if you talk to truckers, they love their jobs. And I think part of the paradox there, and I was hoping you folks could talk about this a little bit, is the fact that alienation has two meanings. You have the alienated worker, which is a psychological condition, but then you have alienation in the sense of Marx, where value is being extracted, alienated from the worker, right? So in the case of truckers, for example, you've got this white working class male culture that's formed around trucking, and it's created an amazing infrastructure. It's created diners, it's created the jeans that we're wearing, it's created country western music, right? All of that goes into making sure these guys aren't feeling alienated. So I'm hoping you could sort of tease apart those two dimensions of alienation.
You want to answer this question before Lily asks them? Or you want to collect everything?
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much for these talks that really were so helpful and informative and specific. Really got me, I really learned a lot. My questions maybe more to anyone, but I think it came up more with Nupur and Maggie's talk, where what is the importance of memory in the practices and these kind of evolving, forms of, say, trust networks, as Sridham was asking us about, or the potentials for solidarity that Sarita is asking about. Like, what's the role of memory in that? And the reason why, and this is the comment part, is this thing about tech workers are organizing because now even their jobs are being feminized, I actually think misunderstands what my direct experience with a lot of these tech worker organizing circles has been, which is that it's not that you have a bunch of white guys who are like, oh crap, my work is now being undervalued. Like, most of these white workers are not involved in these movements. It's a very small subset of people who, like, very specifically are like an Irish working class guy who, like, ended up getting a job in a place that was kind of unlikely, or like a Muslim woman who was like subject to visa regimes, like several black workers, many like white women as well, who like have always kind of been seeing what the tech industry has been, the kind of hierarchies that it's made of. And it's more like those people are kind of coming together and making a ruckus that's maybe bigger than their proportion in the population. And so I think that's where these disparate memories of difference are being synthesized into something that can maybe form something of a solidarity. And that's where the question is coming from.
Thanks for great questions. I might just start with Srita's on gender, because it's pretty straightforward. And of course, all the tuk-tuk drivers I interviewed were men. And there's a huge story about masculinity here and the masculinity of tuk-tuk driving, which I didn't go into, but I would love to talk about. A lot of people talk about, when they talk about the gendered expectations for their jobs, they talk about sometimes being out in the hot sun and working out in the hot sun as like something that a man can do, partially because of the color of skin and the desirability for women to have fair skin, so not wanting to go outside and drive in the hot sun. So that's kind of a phrase that came up a lot. But also, like, some of the drivers that I talked to feeling like that limited their options in some ways. So in another context in which I worked with like mom and pop shops, there was always a driver, and then also there were people using social media for like you know, talking about clothes and stuff like that. And in that case, it was so gendered in that like the men were the drivers and the women tended to be the customer service representatives or working on social media, partially for those same dynamics about like what is, you know, seen as good work. And I mean, I don't really know how to take that further analytically, other than like when I'm drawn to looking at, you know, interesting in like innovative uses of technologies in the field, and but I always have to come to this recognition that like these are always going to be bounded by certain historical factors, including gender. Maybe not always, but they certainly are now, and kind of taking that as like an assumption. And I think some questions of memory are kind of similarly there, where it's like these long-lasting questions about, you know, ethnicity, and that comes up in tuk-tuk driving all the time. So some of the things I was saying around the xenophobia and the Indianness of the new tuk-tuks comes up in other conversations around, you know, the Chinese influence, and that's a very racialized conversation. And historically, there's a lot of anger still against Vietnamese for the Vietnamese occupation in the 80s, and that comes into conversations all the time. So I think that all of these factors are just complicating. Like they're all, you know, when we look at these questions in a silo, I don't think that we can get the full picture. So all of these other questions are really important.
Speaking first to Sarita's question, so I think it's awesome that you brought up the visibility-invisibility binary, because the way I saw it was that, like, you know, referring to Starr, Strauss, Bowker, all of that work where, like, we have a very specific example. I mean, like the study of nurses, and I think it was a point made fairly clearly that like, we can't blanket advocate for visibility as a good thing. So it was, after having read that and then going to feel, I mean, it was already obvious that we shouldn't be celebrating either visibility or visibilizing as necessarily always an act of power or empowerment. But tying it into questions of gender, it became even more interesting when I more recently moved away from studying ride-hailing drivers who are mostly all male doing kind of masculine work, but to look at like platformized beauticians. So are women doing work through platforms and doing a very particular kind of feminized, gendered labor. And what was interesting is that I felt like I could tie it into Gillespie's articulation of platforms, so like standing on platforms or being through platforms and different kinds of ways of thinking about platforms. And I was thinking about how the women informants were telling me that we in fact like platform work because given all the socio-cultural economic dynamics of working as a woman in India at the time when women are exiting the workforce, this allows me the kind of discretion and relative invisibility, which is awesome, because I don't even actually have to tell my family or extended relatives that I have a job. And it's even more interesting because the platform also understands the engagement as a kind of loosey-goosey engagement. So it's like I hung out for like 2 months in the platform training center's office. And it was well understood within the training center that these women work, but then they often quit and they are never in touch. But when they come back, we still maintain them as our reserve force. So it's okay, it works for us and them. And the women kind of saw it as a good thing as well, because again, it was a little bit about the gendered nature of what it means to be like either a married or a single mother. Operating within the family context. And so I guess what I learned from all of that was that there could be like a non-economic, but a more predominantly socio-cultural articulation of what platform work means within the lives of workers. And I guess that's the gender analytic that I would think about. I don't really have an answer to some of what Lily said and Sarita said, which is like I can't personally think about or I guess I can think about it from a place of either stability and instability as being extremely important to the political potential of anybody. And I guess being like a transnational worker, that's the dominant frame of thinking. And hence, I find myself always also being sympathetic about, again, how it visibilizes you as a person or a worker if you're protesting or doing something within the context where within a world where citizenship is increasingly becoming a privilege rather than something that everyone has. So then how do we think about visibility again? I'm with you on the questions of trust and regimes of trust. I'd love to talk about it more, but the only inflection that I have in terms of a narrative of trust is like a narrative of suspicious trust, or like one that's almost always punctured with some amount of suspicion, and it's almost an act of self-preservation or forms of caution that inflect having trust in anything. The union, the platform, anyone, or including me, a researcher who claims to want to do good, and the first question is, tell me why you're here. And the answer I give is, oh, but like, trust me, like, I'll help you do something, I'll put my recommendations in like a policy framework, or like, I'm not here to make money off you. And that even induces more suspicion, because it's like, we know of companies and startups looking to be rich off us, and we know that pitch, but we're not sure why you're here. So I don't know about that. Just speaking to some of the like truckers stuff, I think Karen Levy also has like, all of her work is around this, so I'm not completely equipped to talk about this, but I do want to add to the figure of the white trucker, the figure of the immigrant trucker, which is also now a US trucker. And there's this wonderful story about how there's a lot of Punjabi diners to service South Asian immigrant truckers, so that's also been really interesting. Yeah, I'll just stop here.
I meant to add, Karen Levy's on my committee and has given me feedback on this work, so the connection to her, I'm glad that was brought up. I'm happy for an ability to acknowledge her help with this.
Yeah, great questions from everybody. A few quick things. One on moving beyond visibility and invisibility. I completely am sympathetic to that. I think in many ways I'm interested in all vision as partial. And hypervisibility plays some role in that, of how one gets positioned as hypervisible. The issue of the starchitects, that's a question I've gotten a few times, and I think that that's an interesting one. And I have, so why pick these guys to imagine something differently? I'd say two lines of thought for me. One, I don't want to collapse representation and identity completely. For me, I just wouldn't make that move as a fully reductive one. But that still leaves the question to some extent. I think it's an interesting question. And part of it, I think part of my response is, and I've gone back and forth on this, part of me wants to get out of a synoptic vision, so that the corporate thing is always a synoptic. This is what globalization looks like. And so part of the sort of counter-imaginary is to do the non-synoptic. I think what these two artists do effectively is counter-synoptics. They too have and part of that is their kind of, you could attribute that to their masculinity, it could be to other things as well. But so so that's certainly not the full range of counter-imaginaries that I think would be in play. And I would still want to defend them as really compelling, I think. So two other things. One question that hasn't been brought up so much, we've talked about time. The other thing that hasn't been brought up is questions of distance, which I guess is like a deep thread through my project of what it means to, whether questions of how to navigate or whether one can navigate distance are being reimagined in the current period, which I guess the hunch behind this book project is that they are. That at the height of globalization, distance was completely discounted, and part of tech is seen as one of the mechanisms through which distance becomes inconsequential. I think with a lot of the kind of glitches and fuck-ups of, I guess we're still being lively streamed, you could beat that one, of the screw-ups of globalization, I think these questions of proximity, I think, are deeply on the table in many different forms. I don't think there's one form of it, but I think there are many ways, many sites in which distance is seen increasingly as not something that one can take for granted. One site that I think is very interesting where you see this appearing is new attention to shipping, and how shipping has been treated, I think, largely in many aspects of it as an externality to globalization. It's not been folded in. How it gets measured in terms of the global footprint and climate change is like suddenly really a hot topic for a lot of companies. So that interests me. I really think distance, so I say that what I'm doing in this book is looking at a whole series of what I call proximity experiments. It's where people are trying to, they're thinking distance is a problem, and the question is, so then what? How do you navigate if distance is a problem? And I don't think that means just go local. I'm not so interested in that, but I'm interested in how, so I think the shape of supply chains is changing. Lots of people will talk about that they're tightening, they're shortening, they're being hubbed. So I think that happens. There's a whole lot of stuff going across the US-Mexico border. Anyway, so there are many sites in which I think I would like to add distance alongside speed. And let me just end with the issues of trust. And I guess that comes back to my same issue about community and what's shared, and maybe the difference between thinking about, for me, community and a commons or a commoning project. I am with you. I think that the suspicion is a good place to begin. This is a system of intense inequalities. The moment that we're in is operating and is built on the capitalist profits are built out of inequalities. So I think trust is not the move I would go to. I think one should have a healthy suspicion. And so I'm interested in that. For me then is, what does it mean to have a collective? Doesn't mean you don't do things collectively. I wouldn't push that to an individual position. But under conditions of inequality and continued forms of exploitation, what does it mean to work in common? I think is.
I'm going to start with the gender politics of my research. So patents describe a disembodied user, but there is a methodological issue there, which is that patents are not supposed to talk about the human. They're supposed to talk about describe an invention. So I'm still struggling with how to interpret that in the context of the kind of genre that the patent represents. But yeah, definitely de-gender, disembodied kind of user. And then in my own research, it's inside the warehouse, the gender politics kind of are. I want to mention the kind of division of labor that runs along gendered lines. So in terms of vertical division of labor, it's one interesting thing is to notice how, at least at the initial ladders of the hierarchy, you have all these young women who become team leaders, and possibly from the outside. So there is very little vertical mobility inside an Amazon warehouse. There is lots of horizontal mobility, between different tasks, and there is a lot of resentment among white male workers because they cannot go up the ladder while they see these young women, or even worse, young, although white immigrants, bossing them around. So there is a interesting clashes around gender politics and division of labor there. There are also very specific forms of division of labor which revolve around feminized forms of labor. So, for example, in Zalando, which is a fashion e-commerce company, it's German, it's not present in the States, but it's all over Europe. So there's the reproduction of an old form of division of labor around feminized kind of jobs. So a number of women ironing and folding clothes, while all the team leaders and all the pickers and stowers tend to be men. So in that case, there is a very specific division of labor which reproduces very old gender politics, and it hasn't been changed at all by the new digital reorganization of labor inside the warehouse. Actually, it's a concentration of jobs that the women have been doing in their households, and it's now concentrated inside the warehouse, but pretty much made invisible still there. And finally, very quickly, the alienation point. Yeah, very interesting. So I think there are mechanisms that kind of try to counter the kind of psychological alienation that some of those companies put in place. while optimizing the other kind of alienation, so the extraction of value. So for example, at Amazon, there is all these ideological interventions by management inside the warehouse to kind of like counter this feeling of alienation that workers have, because it's a repetitive task and it's like highly policed and so on and so forth. So team briefings, meetings, singing together, going out for pizza parties, the power hour where you're asked to like run from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. The fastest worker, the most productive workers will win, you know, like an Amazon T-shirt or something like that. And also marketing activities that target prospective workers. So there is public communication about how cool it is to work at Amazon, trying to counter the workers' own communications about how bad it is to work at Amazon. Also those places mirror Silicon Valley campuses. So, you know, you have the super colorful canteen with the foosball table, like all that stuff, all that transparency and colorfulness and networked kind of team-based forms of labor. It's a caricature of those other super privileged workplaces in Silicon Valley, if you wish, if you compare it to a warehouse, of course. Very similar to what Gramsci identified in factories back in the 20s and 30s, an attempt at prescribing workers' lives outside of the walls of the warehouse. So generating an Amazon worker in a holistic manner, in a sense. So there is definitely that which attempts at countering alienation. And then and I'm going to wrap up with this. Workers are acutely aware that new technologies that may be introduced in the workplace, on the shop floor in the future, may increase their psychological alienation. So they fear the moment where they will be isolated in workstations. They won't even be able to talk to their fellow workers because robots will actually, they will only interact with robots.
Unfortunately, we're way over time. So I welcome you all to join me again in thanking our wonderful panelists and my